Радвам се, че сте с нас този следобед. Казвам се Траян Траянов, програмен директор в фондация Заедно в час. Имам удоволствието да ви представя панела за иновативни практики в подготовката на нови и опитни учители. Лектор днес ще бъде Мари Хамър, която е до мен. Мари е човек за пример за нас в общността на Заедно в час, някой, който много ни вдъхновява. Тя е млад човек, получи образование на световно ниво, който е избрал да бъде учител и не просто учител, а учител, който е работил в училища, които работят с най-нуждаещите се ученици и ученици от непривилегировани общности. Освен това, Мари е учител на учители. Дълги години, през последните години тя е била главен обучител в веригата от училища Art Schools. За тези от вас, които са идвали на предишни наши конференции, вече сме имали възможност да представим тези наистина успешни училища в Великобритания. Мари също така е декан на новосъздадения Институт по педагогика. Интересното за този институт, ще имаме възможност да чуем повече за него, е това, че първо той е създаден от училища, именно от такива вериги училища, които работят с най-нуждаещите се ученици в Великобритания. И изповядва философията, че първо учителите не трябва да бъдат подготвени за някаква фиксирана дефиниция на това какво значи отлично образование. Те самите трябва да са изследователи, те трябва да са практици, да са хора, които разширяват и променят, еволюират дефиницията на отлично образование с практиката си. И второто нещо, което е много особено и специфично с този институт, е това, че обучението на учителите се случва именно през практиката, именно в училище, там където има най-голяма нужда от тях.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for having me. Just as I was sat there listening to someone talk about me in a completely different language, and thinking about the fact that when I finish talking, I get to sit down and put these headphones on and listen to this simultaneous translation, and that's the kind of thing we've only ever seen on TV. I had one of those moments where you're like, wow, is this happening to me? And I actually had a very similar moment when I arrived in Sofia on Wednesday, and I got to my hotel room, and I'm very lucky to be on the 8th floor, and so there's this really lovely view of the whole city. And so I obviously just dropped my bags and went straight to the window. And as I was looking out across the horizon, I definitely had that moment where you have in life where you kind of step back and you think and you reflect and you think, is this happening to me? Like, did somebody ask me to come to their country, to their conference to talk about the work that I do? And I think that moment of kind of surprise was partly because, you know, the program that I lead in the UK, yes, it's had some good results, which we'll be able to share later, but it's really early in its development. And me and my team spend all of our time talking about what we still want to improve and we still want to achieve. But also, or more so, I think the reason I had that moment was because none of this, being here talking to you today, being in the position that I'm in, was supposed to happen to someone like me. I grew up in a neighbourhood in Manchester, in the north of England, that had really high poverty rates, really high crime rates, very low education achievement rates, and very low job prospects. My dad was a truck driver, and my mum was a dinner lady, so the kind of person who supervises children during their lunchtime at school. And so they had the kind of unskilled jobs that the statistics in my country say would make me far, far, far less likely to get the results at school, which mean I could go on to university and a career of my choice. Of course, luckily for me, I did. And then I was fortunate enough to get on the Teach First program. And even luckier, I think, to just simply fall in love with teaching almost straight away. I think it's a real gift when so early on in your working life, you find a job that you love, that you think is important, and that you know if you work hard and you think hard, then you can get better and better at, and you can enjoy more and more and make more and more of a difference. So there are lots of reasons why I genuinely feel very privileged to be here talking to you today. And I think it's about almost the theme of journeys that I want to talk to you about today. And I want to talk about the journey of a teacher's development, and very specifically where initial teacher training fits within that journey. So initial teacher training being the course that our graduates in our country go on to become licensed to teach. But first, I want to put that journey in the context of the journey that the UK education system has gone on in the last 2 decades. So back when I was in primary school, my primary school was featured on a documentary on the BBC as an example of the terrible state of school buildings, kind of water leaking from the roofs as teachers were trying to teach. But now, today, when I visit other countries, I realise that the UK now has some of the most well-resourced schools in terms of facilities and technologies in the entire world. Today, in our system, schools are ranked nationally and publicly for everyone to see on how well pupils progress in their schools. And in our inspection system, you cannot be considered to be a good school unless the poorest students in your school do just as well as all your other children. Thanks to Teach First also, working in those kinds of schools with lots of pupils from low-income families is now a really popular first career choice for top graduates. And the recent government statistics about those entering the teaching profession suggests, in one way, we have a generation of the best qualified teachers ever. So more people entering teaching have a first-class degree than ever before. And yet, still in England today, children born into low-income families are only half as likely to get 5 good GCSEs as other children. And 5 good GCSEs really is the minimum that you need to be able to have a chance of going on to university and a career of your choice. And so since I was in school in the UK, and even since I've been working within the UK education system, there has been a lot of change. Our school buildings have changed, our curriculums have changed, our exams have changed, and our accountability system has changed several times, and each time putting more and higher expectations on teachers and school leaders. And yet, still, in the UK, if you are a child born into a low-income family, you are half as likely to get the qualifications you need to go to university and into a career of your choice. So in my time in teaching, there's been a lot of change in the education system and only some improvement in the achievement for our poorest pupils. Why might this be? So, Hattie, in his paper, The Politics of Distraction, talks about the 5 distractions that either governments or other agents of change within an education system often devote lots of time, money, and energy to, thinking that will lead to better outcomes for pupils. But actually, in fact, the research shows those changes do not lead to significant changes for pupils. Back in the UK, we've put a lot of time, money, and energy over the last 20 years into these 5 distractions, and particularly number 1 and 2, a lot of money into number 4. And on 5, actually, I'm just going to pause because he talks there about fixing teachers as a distraction. And obviously, I'm about to go on and talk about how developing teachers is really valuable. What Hattie talks as being a distraction that systems often engage with in fixing teachers is either they decide that the way to fix teachers is to change the bar that you have to get through to get into teaching. You all have to have really strong academic qualifications. Or they make it easier to get rid of weak teachers. Or they decide that they'll just pay their good teachers more. Or also they decide that if they give teachers lots of technology to play with in their lessons, that will make them better teachers. And the research shows that none of those things make a significant difference to the outcomes of pupils. Hattie says the only way you can change the outcomes of pupils is if you change what happens in the classroom. The only way you can improve the quality of learning for pupils is to improve the quality of teaching. Government, agents of change in the system, school leaders, the thing that we should be spending our time, money, and energy on is getting better at developing our teachers and equipping them with the instructional strategies that actually work and make a difference to pupil outcomes. So when I got into to teacher training back in 2009, it was because in my time as a teacher in the system, I'd seen a lot of structural changes, a lot of these 5 distractions, but I'd seen very, very little change in the way that we train and support our teachers. Over these last kind of 20 years, there has been a big shift in the system's expectations for our poorest pupils. And so it's good now that in the UK, it's not acceptable for leaders, school leaders, to sit in a meeting looking at pupil achievement data and discussing those pupils who are underachieving and to simply shrug their shoulders and say, well, what do you expect? They can't do any better. It is, however, still acceptable and quite common for those same school leaders to sit in a meeting looking at data on teacher performance and discuss the teachers that are underperforming and say, well, what do you expect? They can't do any better. And so when I went into teacher training, I went in to try to change that. And the teacher training program, the teacher preparation program that I set up 4 years ago was founded on 2 principles. A great teacher for every child, and that every teacher could be a great teacher with the right support at the right time. Now, that first principle was born of what we all know to be true, and that's about the incredible impact that a teacher can have on a young person's life. But also of the research that shows us now that a top performing teacher can have a huge impact on a child from a low-income community. So depending on which study you reference, it's up to 9 months of extra learning in one school year if a child from a low-income background is taught by a top-performing teacher. The schools I work with at ARC all serve low-income communities. And the pupils, when they come to our schools, are often years and years behind their more affluent peers. And so we commit to accelerating their progress, radically accelerating their progress, so that by the time they leave our schools, they have the same strong academic background and can have the same equal chance of going to university and into a career of their choice. So obviously, we would love our schools to be staffed by these top-performing teachers that can have such an impact on pupils' progress. Unfortunately, there aren't that many top-performing teachers in the system. So when we started developing this initial teacher training program, back then, only 16% of schools in England were considered to have an outstanding quality of teaching. So outstanding being the term for that top-performing quality of teaching in our inspection system. And also the research showed us around recruitment that the strongest teachers are the least likely to choose to work in what we term as challenging contexts, those schools that serve low-income communities. So we were faced with the challenge of the fact that there weren't that many top-performing teachers, and they were unlikely to come and work for our schools. And also, even if we did manage to attract them to leave their school and come to us, we were simply moving the problem around elsewhere in the system. So we founded what was and is still called ARC Teacher Training and is becoming the Institute for Teaching this year. We founded that because we simply knew we had to find a way to develop our own great teachers. And that brings us to the second of those principles, the idea that every teacher can be a great teacher with the right support at the right time. And it's really the second part of that sentence that we like to emphasize, the right support at the right time. So thinking about a teacher's long development towards becoming a top-performing teacher and the place that initial year of training where you get your license to teach, think about the role that plays. What is the right support at the right time? How does what you train people on and how you train them change depending on how experienced and how expert the teachers are you're working with? So to begin to illustrate this, I'm going to change completely from the field of education into the field of art. And I'd like you to spend just 30 seconds thinking to yourself, looking at these paintings, which of them do you believe was painted by Pablo Picasso?
Поемнах да търся работа.
Feel free to talk to the person next to you if you want to. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm just going to reveal the answers. So these were painted by Pablo Picasso. So I'm going to see if this works now. Okay, so over here, this one, I believe he painted this around the age of 15. And you can see really clearly at this point, he's really imitating the classical Renaissance style. He then moves to Paris at quite a young age. And you can see here in this portrait that he's heavily influenced by the great artists around him in Paris at the time. This is very, very similar to the Impressionist art. And over here, you can see him having a go at imitating Toulouse-Lautrec. But then he starts to develop confidence and competence in his own artistic endeavors, and he starts to innovate. And so he's part of a group of artists that developed the Cubist movement. And then you obviously have these paintings here, which when we do this, this is the one that people most obviously associate with Pablo Picasso. But actually, he didn't start painting these types of work until much later in his career. And you can see this by looking actually at a series of self-portraits that he did at different points in his life. Okay, so over here, Pablo, aged 9.5, where he's just practicing his lines and his shading and his perspective whilst drawing a statue that was actually in the family home. But his first self-portrait here, he's a very young man, an early teenager. Again, you can really see the influence of the Impressionists that were popular and successful at the time. Once he's then started to really master the basic skills of art and his ability to express himself through them, he gains confidence and starts imitating with the use of color. So this is his blue period, but you can really see the link still to the Impressionist movement that he's grown out of. And then these last two, again, are ones that are much more recognizable as Picasso's style. But these were created much later in his life. This is him having a go at being an artist 9.5. This self-portrait he didn't do until his 50s. So what does this have to do with teacher training? Well, it's because this idea of starting out by imitating and then innovating and then inventing, those three phases are the phases of our overarching philosophy around teacher development. And what I want to talk to you about today is initial teacher development, which is that first phase, and what this means for what means the right support at the right time for a novice teacher. How is that different, working with somebody at the beginning of their skill and knowledge development, than somebody who's already mastered that and is an expert? So there's loads I could say on this topic. I'm pretty obsessed with teacher training, but I'm going to focus on just three things, and that is scaffolding, working memory, and deliberate practice. So scaffolding, really similar to what we do with all of our pupils, of course. We're really, really careful about what we decide to introduce them to first, next, and later in any curriculum that we're working with them for. And we take the same very thoughtful approach to how we map out the curriculum for our brand new teachers. We're really clear on what we decide is the right thing to teach them on the very first day of their training in the summer, and how that's different to what we teach them in the very first week that they're in school in September, and how, again, that's different when they come back after Christmas and we're training them in the first week of January. And so, as an example, the model of planning for lessons that we train them on, we expect them to employ in September, is different to the model of planning we introduce to them and expect them to use from January. And then by April, again, we're ramping up the complexity and we're expecting them to do something different again. So by the time they get to the end of their 9 months of initial teacher training with us, they've moved from this as their first lesson plan performer to this as the top of their kind of final summer term lesson plan performer. Now, again, this might sound really obvious because we do this with our pupils, and a lot of us are familiar with the idea of scaffolding and the spiral curriculum. But actually, taking this approach with trainee teachers isn't very common in the UK. Universities often feel really pressurized the amount of time they have to train teachers, and they're right. There's very little time for trainee teachers to be back at university learning new things, because in our system, in any teacher preparation program, you're legally required to make sure that the trainee spends 120 days in a school. So there is a limited amount of time to bring them out of school and introduce new skills to them. So often on teacher training programs in the UK, you'll find in their curriculum they have one day dedicated to how to plan. And because how to plan a lesson is something they're going to need the moment they go into a school, which typically is in October, that one day on planning ends up being right at the beginning of their course. And because there's only one day, the person leading that session introduces them to everything they want them to know about planning a great lesson. But a new teacher, a novice at that point in their training, cannot process all of that information. They cannot put all of that learning into practice straight away. And that brings me on to the idea of working memory. And so with working memory, it's our kind of capacity to process new and live information. And for all of us, we have a limited capacity in our working memory. And we all rely in the knowledge that we've built up over time that's stored in our long-term memory. We rely on those maps of knowledge around a particular field to help us process new information there and then in the moment efficiently and effectively. And the working memory capacity of a novice is more limited to that of an expert. They enter a new field of learning, they don't have all of that knowledge banked in their long-term memory. They don't have a map of the knowledge for that field. And so they don't have enough knowledge to draw on to process new information efficiently and effectively. And so we take this into account in two different ways in our training, both in how that affects our new teachers' ability to process new information in a training session with us, but also how that affects their ability to execute, to apply new learning when they get into the classroom. Now, when we think about the new teachers we work with, and that you all have all worked with, it in some ways seems a little strange to think that they have limited capacity for processing information, because we will all have had that experience of these wonderful top graduates who, right at the beginning of their year, can engage in a really interesting debate with us around theories of learning or discussions around which pedagogical approach to use, what they believe the purpose of education is. And so we're not saying that a new teacher can't engage intellectually with lots of new ideas. It's about the ability in that moment to process that new learning sufficiently so they will retain it, they'll walk out of that training session and they will put it successfully into practice in the classroom the very next day. So when we are planning any training session for our new teachers, we start out by actually listing what are the actions that we would expect to see in this teacher's classroom the next day if the training had been successful. And after that, we then think about what's the content and what are the activities that we can use in the training session to help them secure that new learning. So they are confident and competent by the time they walk out of the room, so they will put it into practice the next day. And so what have we learned over the few years? We've been doing this about what constitutes this effective practice, helping people to really process new information and develop confidence and competence around it, so they go into their classrooms and do it the very next day. Well, this is a typical structure for our face-to-face training sessions. And so at the beginning, we start, of course, with a big picture that we take from theory or research around the best practice, the most effective instructional strategies in a given area of the curriculum. And the trainer will then help them really distill what are the principles of best practice? What does this mean a teacher should do in their classroom as a result of this theory or research? But then we do the really important thing that takes that abstract learning idea and makes it concrete. And doing stuff that's concrete is much more digestible for a new teacher. And so we get them to analyze a video footage of a great teacher doing that best practice. And we really train them to be very good at breaking down what the teacher is doing into tiny, tiny actions. And so then after analysing the video, they have a list of what we call these teacher moves. These tiny things that the teacher was doing that together made the learning effective in that moment. And then we get them to practice those teacher actions, and they get feedback on how well they're doing them, and they re-practice and they re-practice. And that practicing really helps develop their real understanding of what makes them effective and the confidence that when they walk into school the next day, they can have a go in their own classroom. Now, the idea of using practice in our training sessions perhaps doesn't sound that distinctive. And that's because, as Anders Ericsson says in his book, Peak, a lot of us feel that we're doing practice a lot of the time because we repeat things, and we believe with repeating things we will get better at them, but actually it's only a very specific type of practice that leads to improved performance. And he lists 3 success criteria. So the first one is that whatever you're practicing has to be at the edge of your comfort zone. And I've already talked about how we make sure we make really clear choices about what it is our trainees are learning every single week. So that it really is always pushing them to the edge of their comfort zone. But in the sessions, it's really important that when they're practicing those tiny aspects of the skill. So they don't just practice questioning in general. They practice one part of a particular type of question. Then they practice another type of question. Then they practice how they respond to a certain answer from a pupil. And then they bring that together to have a go at practicing questioning around an upcoming lesson. And so just to bring these 3 elements together, this is a personal training plan for a primary trainee for the very first 6 weeks of their training year with us. And you can see, like here, is us drawing out very clearly what we think are the key skills they should master in those 6 weeks. They'll learn lots of other things, but these things they have to absolutely master if they're going to be ready for the next 6 weeks of learning. And then we decide which week they'll learn each of those skills. And then what we do is we plot out in very specific terms how it is that in school they can use lots of different training opportunities and activities to revisit that new learning, to practice it, to get feedback on it, to reflect on it, and to refine it. As I said, I could go on for hours about the specifics of how we do different bits of our training, but those are 3 key principles that I wanted to share with you today. I'm sure you're interested to know, well, is this working? And as I said, we're only in our early days, so we only have 3 cohorts of alumni. But if you remember back to our goals that we wanted to produce top performing teachers who would stay working in challenging schools and make a real difference to the lives of our pupils. And so 90% of those who train with us are still teaching in challenging schools. It's not animated. But the real big difference is, are they any good? Are they making a difference to pupils' lives? And as I said, the context is when we started our training program, only 16% of schools in England had that top level quality of teaching. In the schools at ARC, about 20% of teachers are considered to be top performing teachers. Now for us, we only have very new teachers. So the data I'm sharing with you is from teachers who are either in their first full year of teaching or in their second full year of teaching. And yet, 55% of them are considered to be top performing teachers already. Now, real success obviously is not a title you're a top performing teacher, it's about the impact on pupils. And so I thought I'd close with sharing some examples from that percentage of the impact that some of our alumni have had on their pupils. And so I can talk to you about Andrew, who is a history teacher at King Solomon Academy, and you'll be hearing from Max tomorrow. It is one of the top performing schools in the country, in spite of serving a really deprived community. Andrew, in his second full year of teaching, achieved the best GCSE results in the school last year, which is saying something if you're working in one of the top schools in the country. He also taught politics A-level for the first time, and again achieved the best exam results in the school. Or there's Sarah, one of our alumni in our early years training program, who last Easter was asked to take over a class from another teacher because the majority of pupils were off track to meet their target at the end of the year. She had 12 weeks left to teach them and accelerate their progress. And yet by the end of those 12 weeks, 93% of those pupils had achieved their target. And their results ended up being the best in the whole network. Or there's Richard, again, a primary school teacher. And in our primary school system in the UK, we just started to change how we assess our primary pupils. And so the top level of performance a primary school child can have in a year is called to have greater depth of understanding of your whole curriculum. Last year, nationally, 5% of pupils achieved that standard of greater depth. In Richard's classroom, 100% of pupils achieved that standard, which is an astonishing impact. But all those three and many of our trainees are genuinely changing lives with the quality of their teaching, even though they're already so early on in their career. The last thing I will say is when I share our approaches back in the UK, there is some uneasiness from my colleagues in universities doing their own programs. And their uneasiness can probably best summed up in one example of a colleague that I used to work with at Canterbury Christchurch University when I trained teachers on the Teach First programme. And we were debating our philosophy of teacher development. And she was remembering how frustrated she was as an experienced teacher in her school receiving training that she felt was too basic. And she said, I don't need to be told how to plan a lesson. I don't need to be told how to ask questions. I don't need to be told what activity to use at the start of my lesson or how to finish a lesson. I don't need to be told exactly what behaviour management technique to use in any given situation. And apparently she'd expressed this frustration to her head teacher at the time by saying, I'm Picasso. I don't need to be taught how to paint by numbers. And painting by numbers is a reference to like children's colouring books, where there's a number that tells the child to fill in what colour. And she was right. She didn't need that because she was already an expert teacher. But we believe it's different when you're dealing with novice teachers. The right support at the right time. We all want our teachers to go on to be artists in their classroom, to inspire the next generation of students. And Andrew, Sarah, and Richard are already doing that. They are genuinely transforming the life chance of their pupils. But Andrew, Sarah, and Richard all started out on their very first day of training, practicing how to greet students at the door, practicing how to change their voice when they're talking about learning to then correcting someone to put their pen down. They practiced little bits of questioning before they put it together and made it more complex. They started out with a simple lesson plan before they went to a complex one. At ARC, we want all of our teachers to become the teaching equivalent of Pablo Picasso. But in thinking about how we plot that journey for them, we recognise where Pablo Picasso started.